Chapter 3. Stuck with Raymond. Mom should have been on her way to work the next morning, but she hovered around the breakfast table, running her hands through her short, dark hair until it stuck up in all directions. "I know you boys are going to have a good time," she said, sounding more like she was trying to convince herself. "Sure, Mom." Taking Raymond along was going to be about as much fun as going to visit Kev's great Aunt Mabel, who didn't like growing boys and kept telling you so about every 5 minutes. Scott glanced at the clock. It was about 9. He gulped down the last of his milk and stood up. "We have to go or we'll be late," he said. Mom rushed out of the room and came back with a new yellow baseball cap. "This is from your father," she said, handing it to Raymond. "Thank you." Smiling, Raymond put it squarely on his head. Somehow the cap looked out of place on Raymond. He was dressed in a clean t-shirt and jeans. Even his sneakers looked almost new. Being seen with him was going to be downright embarrassing. Oh well, it was only for one day. Scott picked up their sack lunches and handed Raymond's to him. Raymond tucked the sack into his school pack and slipped his arms through the straps. "You don't need that," said Scott. "We're only going to be gone for a little while." "Yes, I do. I plan to collect some plant specimens for a summer science project," Raymond answered. Scott shook his head. "Boy, leave it to Raymond," he muttered as he opened the screen door and hurried outside. Raymond gave Mom a quick peck on the cheek and rushed after him. Mom followed them to the door. "Raymond, you stay with Scott all the time," she called from the doorway. "And Scott, you take care of your little brother." She only used that tone of voice when she was mad at him or worried about something he was going to do. Scott had a hunch it was both. "Don't worry, Mom. I will." Scott felt a twinge of worry himself. What if Raymond got hurt or something? He was sort of a frail looking little kid. Scott was glad they weren't riding their bikes. Raymond waited until they were too far down the walk for Mom to hear. Then he said, "You don't have to worry about me. I'm capable of taking care of myself." "Maybe so," said Scott. "But just remember, going to Mosswood Creek isn't like having a picnic in the park." "I'm aware of that. I have read several books on the subject of hiking, and we haven't got time for that now. The guys are waiting." Scott walked a little faster. Raymond stopped talking and ran a few steps to catch up. They were only a block from home when Scott thought he heard a soft pad of footsteps behind them. He turned and looked back. Nobody was there. "What's wrong?" Raymond asked, looking back too. "Nothing, I guess." Scott hurried on. When they got to Rusty's, the yard was already full of kids of all sizes, running, shouting, and swarming over the swings and slide. Raymond's head swiveled back and forth, trying to see everything at once. "Do the O'Haras run a daycare center?" Scott had forgotten that this was Raymond's first visit. "No, it's always like this around here. Come on." He led Raymond around to the backyard. The baseball game was getting ready to start. "Scott, look." Raymond, his face bright with excitement, pointed. "There are Joey and Sean. They're in my room at school." About that time, Joey saw Raymond too and trotted over. "You going to play baseball with us?" Scott left them there when he saw Rusty and Kev and Eric coming from the tool shed. They were loaded down with a bucket, an old fish net with long handle and small roll of rabbit wire, and a fishing pole with a big limp looking rubber worm tied to the end of it. Rusty and Kev were carrying sack lunches too, and as usual, Eric had his lunch in his day pack on his back. You ready to go? Rusty asked, handing Scott the bucket. All set. Scott wished they could leave all this junk behind and get to the creek. Getting Dad's mitt back was more important than catching that old crayfish. Scott called to Raymond, wishing he could leave him there at Rusty's too. Taking him along was going to be a real pain. The sidewalk ended a block from the house. They walked along the side of the road in a single file until they came to the path that led across the open field, covered with tall grass and weeds. Raymond took a thin book out of the pocket of his pack and glanced at it as they walked along. Scott couldn't see the title, but he knew it wasn't a mystery or an adventure story. Raymond hadn't read anything interesting since he was 4 and discovered the encyclopedias. The path ended at the old dirt road. They turned right and spread out in a ragged line. Their feet kicked up little puffs of dust as they moved along the winding road lined with bushes and trees. "What time did the note say Tiger's going to meet you at the creek?" Eric asked, shifting the roll of rabbit wire from one shoulder to the other to give his arm a rest. 10 o'clock, Scott answered. He's probably there right now, and we should be too. Scott looked back to see what was keeping Raymond. He caught a glimpse of something tan behind Raymond just before it went crashing off into the bushes at the side of the road. A deer or a dog? It didn't matter, it was gone. Scott turned his attention back to Raymond, who was zigzagging back and forth across the road with his book in hand. "Raymond, what are you doing?" Scott strode back to him. "I'm identifying plants." Raymond pointed out a bunch of dusty yellow flowers growing in the tall grass. "That's a Chilia millefolium. The common name is yarrow. And this white one is Adachis carota, the wild carrot. Not edible, of course. The common name is Queen Anne's lace." "I don't care what they are," Scott yelled. "You can look at all that stuff when we get back to the creek. Now come on." He grabbed Raymond by the arm and ran to catch up. "Alan didn't believe me when I told him how big old Oscar is," Rusty was saying. "He said crayfish never get bigger than 6 inches tops. But he'll pay twice as much if Oscar measures 7 inches." Rusty waved the fishing pole in the air and grinned. "That's money in the bank." "You mean if we catch him?" Eric grinned. "Last time, will you guys stop worrying about that dumb old crayfish? I have to get Dad's mitt back first." Scott hurried past him, dragging Raymond along with him. What if Tiger had gotten there ahead of them and thrown Dad's mitt into the creek? Tiger was mean enough to do a thing like that. He had to get there quick and make sure it didn't happen.